Well, good afternoon. My name is Anand Rao, Professor of Communication and Chair of UMW's Department of Communication and Digital Studies. And I'm excited to welcome you back to IDS 300 Life After COVID. Those of you that tuned in last year for COVID-19 in context will recognize our two presenters today, and you're in for a real treat. You know, last summer, these two presenters talked to us about the impact COVID would have and that they anticipated having on congressional and presidential election in 2020. And boy, I tell you, it was really great to be that informed before the presidential campaign and the congressional campaign, as we saw so much of it come true and come to fruition as the way that they outlined in the presentation. Today, they're going to talk about the federal government, how it struggles to respond to COVID. And we've certainly seen aspects of that struggle. It's going to be great to hear a bit about this from the congressional and presidential perspectives. Our presenters today are Dr. Rosalind Cooperman, professor of political science, and Dr. Stephen Farnsworth, who's a professor of political science and director of UMW's Center for Media and Leadership Studies. Now, I'm going to turn it over to them in just a moment, but first I want to give you a reminder about the format and a couple of the boxes that you have access to today. Now, the format will be the same as we've been following. We have about 4 o'clock till 4:30 for their presentation, and it'll be followed by a Q&A for about half an hour, and we'll conclude that by 5 o'clock. We'll be back, Dr. Betsy Lewis, Dr. Keith Mellinger, and myself will be back at 4:30 to start that Q&A. Now, in order to give us those questions for the Q&A, you should look for the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom webinar, and you can enter your questions there. And don't forget to read over the questions as they're entered, because it's a chance for you to upvote those questions that you'd like to see us make sure that we ask the presenters. We've had some fantastic questions and some really great conversations that have been prompted by those questions in the previous sessions. But, you know, truth be told, we haven't gotten through probably even half of the questions. So we really rely on you to read over those questions and to upvote those questions so that we can make sure we pose those first to the presenters when we get to the Q&A. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the presenters. And I believe the first presenter today will be Dr. Steve Farnsworth. Dr. Farnsworth.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be part of this conversation. It is a reality that a focus of our situation relating to COVID involves significant government involvement. It's government research that gives us the information, government testing that gives us the approval or not of medications, and then, of course, political choices by political leaders, including presidents and elected officials of other levels, from congressmen to senators and governors, that help make sure that the process unfolds in a way that's acceptable. And that process can offer up all kinds of opportunities for people to go in different directions. Some states are thinking that lotteries are the way to go to maximize the enrollment in the COVID inoculation program. Still others are looking at the issues that relate to the different shots and ways of getting that out. And when we talk about the differences in political approaches, it's really very clear that when we look at the presidential side of the conversation, which is what I'm focusing on, you can see two very different approaches through the presidencies of Donald Trump and of the presidency of Joe Biden. Now, I'm going to be, I've got some screen that I'm going to be sharing here that deals with the questions of the presidential side of this. Dr. Cooperman, who follows me, will have some slides that deal more with the congressional side. And we're both going to do a bit with respect to public opinion. But the thing to appreciate the most at the outset when we're thinking about how presidents have responded to this crisis is to think about this in the context of the way presidents are able to communicate and focus on persuading the public and members of Congress about how to proceed. It's, I think, a truism that the key presidential power is really the power to persuade. Little can be done without public approval for what a president wants. Little can be done without congressional approval of what a president has in mind. And so much of what happens or doesn't happen is a result of this presidential persuasion. Now, this is harder than it sounds. The reason that a person may or may not be persuasive can be very, very wide-ranging, right? I think one of the challenges that presidents are always going to face, and this is a particularly intense one right now, is how do you convince the other side to go along? There's a high level of partisanship in the country in terms of public opinion, and a high level of partisanship in Congress, and that really limits the ability of any president, Democratic or Republican, to secure the kind of support that they want for their legislative priorities. This can include economic stimulus, it could include voting rights bills, it could include just about anything. It's important to remember that even though I would argue that President Trump was very effective at public relations, very effective at dominating the discourse during his time as president, he wasn't always able to get what he wanted from Congress or from the country. If you think about one of his key promises before any of us ever heard about COVID, was this idea of repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare. That didn't happen, even though the Republicans had a majority in the Senate. They tried as well, the opponents of the Affordable Care Act, to try to get the Supreme Court in a third Supreme Court ruling on the Affordable Care Act. And once again, even though Donald Trump has nominated 3 of the current 9 justices on the Supreme Court, he did not get the Supreme Court that he had a significant role in shaping to toss out the Affordable Care Act. So it's a reminder, I think, when you think about what presidents can do. Now, President Trump was effective, I think, at really shaping the discourse. He was able to dominate Twitter in particular and other social media outlets. News reporters around the country really focused on what he had to say. But I think that one of the strategies that Trump employed during his time as president, and that was really sort of demonizing the other side, really limited his ability to reach beyond the 40 or 45% of the country that approved of him throughout his presidency. He never got above 50% approval. Now, Biden is above 50% approval right now, but he's still dealing with the same basic problems of how our political system is designed with a lot of brakes and not a lot of gas pedals, particularly where domestic policy is concerned. Now, when we think particularly about COVID, it is important to note that that there is good news, of course, with respect to how rapidly this vaccine was developed. If you think about many other long-term healthcare issues that we faced in this country, and you compare the length of time it's taken to develop effective treatments for them, and the speed at which a vaccine was developed that is extraordinarily effective with respect to COVID-19, it really is an extraordinarily rapid development. And a lot of that has to do with government funding, government support, government contracts. A lot of those sorts of things really allowed the researchers inside the government, inside the companies that develop these vaccines, to move full speed ahead with a treatment to something that was killing and has killed already more than 600,000 Americans. The bad news, though, is that there's a large number of Americans who hesitate to get this vaccine. They're worried about all sorts of things. There are rumors out there in social media that this might affect fertility. There are rumors out there in social media that people will become magnetized. There are rumors out there in social media that, in fact, people will have chips implanted, and so the government can monitor them in terms of their locations and other things. And so if you are looking at America's division, it really does have a powerful dynamic with respect to the prevalence of these conspiracy theories that are really prominent with significant numbers of the people in the country. Now, one of the things that and this has been one of the problems that the Biden team has focused on. If you look at the efforts by the Biden team to establish a goal, the goal that they offered was 70% of the country will have a first vaccine by the July 4th weekend. That's not going to happen. Right now, we're looking at about 66% of the population that has had one shot. Many of the vaccine treatments require 2. And that is a response from the many people who wanted to receive the vaccine. But for the people who are more hesitant, the next few days are not likely to change a lot of minds. And I think this speaks to just how powerful the partisan dynamic is. I think that the reality that a number of people who are vaccine skeptics have comes out of some of the narratives that President Trump offered during the first year of COVID. Presidents get a lot of credit that they don't deserve for good times, and they get a lot of blame that perhaps they don't deserve for bad times. And the reality is that in terms of timing, the bad news for President Trump is that he was president when COVID hit, and there was an election less than a year away. And the good news for Joe Biden is that he wasn't president when COVID hit, and that he does become president at the time that there is an effective treatment, and that creates all kinds of opportunity for economic development and economic improvement. Now, I want to show you a few slides that speak to this level of division in the country, and then in a few moments, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cooperman. First of all, I want to give you a sense of this division. There was a great deal of concern among supporters of the former president that the economy was suffering more than it needed to because of the lockdowns related to COVID. And so if you look to the bottom of this slide, you can see that people were given the option. Which is more important? Is it better to contain the coronavirus now, even if it hurts the economy? Half the people in the country said that, 51%. Or is it better to rebuild the economy now, even if it hurts efforts to contain the coronavirus? Now, 42% of the country took that option. But what's different here is the way in which those things matched up with the presidential preference of the voters. For those people who thought that containing the coronavirus was the most important issue, the 80% of those people were Biden voters. For the people who thought rebuilding the economy was most important, 76% of them were Trump voters. As you can see, when you look at the overall question of what the most important issue was, you see a very powerful dynamic here. If you were focused on the economy as the most important issue in the election, that was 35% of the electorate. Trump won 82% of those voters. If you were focused on the coronavirus pandemic as the most important issue, Biden won 82% of those voters. Those voters represented 17% of the people voting in the election. Racial inequality comes out a little bit higher in second place than the coronavirus. Crime and safety and healthcare policy a little further back down the line with predictable patterns. You know, the crime and safety folks are going to be more likely to support Trump, and the healthcare folks more likely to support Biden. When you think about how divided America is in terms of public opinion and how divided it is in Congress, it's important to remember that this is a result of divisions that are out there in the court of public opinion. Now, when you ask what the top priority for the new government should be, this is a January 2021 survey, you saw that the coronavirus was right up there with the nation's economy as the most important issue. But again, there was significant division here. Republicans were less likely to think of it as a top priority. Democrats more likely to think so. But what's important here, and I want to draw your attention to this, is not just with the COVID question, but over just about every single one of these priorities, you see significant differences between Republicans and Democrats prioritize these topics. There are only two here that are actually relatively close. Democrats and Republicans will agree that the Social Security system, about half, a little better than that, think that that should be a top priority, making it sound. And then improving the way the political system works, there's an agreement there that that should be a priority. But of course, if we'd asked a second question about how to improve the political system, Democrats and Republicans would likely given us very different answers. The other thing I want to show you from this slide is the extent to which Americans expect an awful lot of government. When you think about all these topics that are top priorities, 4 out of 5 people say it should be the economy. More than 2/3 say it should be the job situation or COVID. More than half say just about everything on this slide. Poor people, educational system, healthcare, improving the political system, protecting against future terrorist attacks. These things are really an immense buffet of challenges for policymakers, because not only are Americans divided, Americans expect the world from their government. And that's part of the reason why they're so often disappointed, because the expectations of presidents and of Congress tend to be pretty unrealistic. Now, speaking of the news, what happens is when there is success in a policy area, there's less coverage of it. Government gets a lot more attention from the media for its failures and its shortcomings than its successes. And so when you look at the issues with respect to what people were focusing on, you could see that there was a great deal more focus on the economy and on immigration, where people were looking for significant improvement than there was for healthcare. I'll also draw your attention to the fact that immigration has become a major focus of right-leaning media outlets. That is a dynamic that is significantly a partisan division. Now, the consequences, though, here are really a significant thing from the point of view of the vaccination rates in different states. And you can see that there is a clear red and blue division here. I've got the most highly vaccinated states on the left, the least fully vaccinated states on the right. Now, I want to draw your attention to one last thing, but this is the last slide I'm showing you before I turn things over to Dr. Cooperman, and that is the extent to which I'm using a different set of numbers here than are often reported. This data includes all state residents, not just those 12 years of age and over. So it includes people who aren't eligible to receive the vaccine. But I think it gives us a better number than what the government is telling us with respect to how much is left to take place with respect to treating this crisis and how large the population of unvaccinated people are. Now, granted, if you're under the age of 12, you can't get a vaccine, but that still means that you can be acquiring this disease. And so when people are thinking about whether they're vaccinated or not and the impact on their families, it seems to me that one other way to look at this is a bit lower number, but perhaps I would argue a more accurate one of the extent to which we really have turned the corner with respect to vaccination rates and immunization patterns. But you see a very, very close correlation with respect to how high the Democratic vote share was in a state and how high the vaccination rate is in that state. The most bluest states in the country are in the left column, the reddest states in the country on the right. It's yet another example of just how divisive politics can be, even where one's own personal health is concerned. People are choosing to be vaccinated or not in ways that reflect their own partisan ideologies with respect to which candidate they supported, but also how severely they considered this epidemic to be. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Cooperman, and I'll be back to talk with you all during the question and answer.
Great, thank you, Dr. Farnsworth. These things always take longer. Now I'm going to share my screen, so I'll pick up the baton as it relates to Congress. And again, I want to echo my colleagues' comments about being delighted to be a part of this class for the second year in a row and bringing in the conversation as it relates to political components of this. And there are a couple of themes that I'm going to touch on that speak to some of the things that we've talked about actually in earlier, not just a year ago, but even earlier slides, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So if Dr. Farnsworth was talking about the presidential component of this and the media coverage of COVID, I'm going to focus on the congressional response. And I've divided this, it's really a tale of two Congresses. Congresses last for 2 years, and the 116th Congress, when COVID really kind of burst onto the scene, occurred during the 116th Congress, right? So 2019, this is following the midterm election of 2018. You've got a Congress from 2019 to 2020. And then after the presidential and congressional elections in 2020, so too begins a new Congress, and in this case, the Congress that we're presently in, the 117th Congress, that runs from 2021 to 2022. And then after, of course, the midterm elections in 2022, we'll move into the 118th Congress. But first, let's take a look at these two Congresses. And just as Professor Farnsworth was talking about the role that partisan preferences and partisan identification plays in this, this is fundamentally true with how Congress as a whole has behaved. I think it's important to recognize that in the context of this, when we're talking about a federal response, there are things that a president can do as a function of executive orders, for example, that hold the force of law so long as a president is in office. But the longer term responses that come from the federal government come through law. And that's where Congress plays a part because they are the ones that pass laws. Congress is the ones who can pass laws. Executives, of course, are the ones who can sign a bill into law or veto them, right? And so the relationship is one. Dr. Farnsworth talked about, the idea that presidents can try to persuade. Oftentimes, they're not just trying to persuade the general public, but they're trying to persuade Congress. That doesn't mean, of course, that Congress is going to listen to presidents, even sometimes when it's in their best interest. And so if we look at the 116th to the 117th Congress, we see some stories that are emerging that speak to that notion of when Congress and the president can act collaboratively, when Congress can act collaboratively across the aisle for legislation. And so in the 116th Congress, we had a Republican president, Donald Trump, and we had a Republican majority in both in the Senate, rather, with a Democratic majority in the House. So in essence, what we call divided government. And despite that, in March of 2020, Congress, with tremendous bipartisan support, passed two pieces of legislation: the Families First COVID Response Act and the CARES Act. And again, this was signed, each act was signed into law by the president and were passed with strong bipartisan support. And in many regards, that set the stage because you did have a federal response, the federal government stepping up in two profound ways, as I'll talk about in greater detail in a minute, but it's cast in the shadow of the ongoing context of both a presidential election and a congressional election. So all members of the House are up for re-election or election if the seat has been vacated, and then a third of the Senate. And most of those Senate seats up for re-election were held by Republican senators. You fast forward to the 117th Congress, and the stage resets a bit, right? You've got, in this case, a Democratic president with Democrat Joe Biden winning the Electoral College vote and the popular vote, and a slim, a reduced Democratic majority in the House, and then a 50-50 split in the Senate with newly elected Vice President Kamala Harris, a former senator, in that tie-breaking role. Congress also passed, again, a federal response, the American Rescue Plan Act. But this instance, it was passed with no Republican support, not a single one, right? Very different from the previous Congress, where the two pieces of legislation, those federal responses to COVID, were passed with strong bipartisan support. And as we're going to see from some of these slides, this unfolds again in another election context. In this case, the midterm elections that are often viewed as a referendum on the sitting president. So in the 116th Congress, as I said, Congress passed the first set of COVID relief bills with strong bipartisan support. And it's important, we look at these price tags, and I don't know how to put them in a context that is, I always call it in my Congress class that I teach, it's monopoly money, right? We don't really understand exactly what $192 billion looks like or $2 trillion look like. But nonetheless, it's important to take a look at what some of the main hallmarks of these responses were. If we think about where we were in March of 2020, recall, for those of you who are thinking about this, I think about this a little bit in Mary Washington time, right? We went on spring break the first week of March. We came back for a week, and then we didn't even have a full week before the university closed, and we pivoted to online instruction. That's about the time when the Families First COVID Response Act was running through Congress, moving through Congress, and then signed into law by President Trump on March 18th. It included things like enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, providing for food security, Medicaid, which is administered by both the federal government and the states to provide access to health care for the poor and disabled. It required employers, particularly in those businesses between 50 to 500, to provide paid sick leave, family and medical leave. And again, these are important things for not just communities, but for families themselves. It also provided free coverage for COVID testing under government health programs. Of course, if you had private insurance, you would be paying for those COVID tests. And I believe that, I know I am not the only family that paid for a couple of those over the last couple of years, or rather within the last year. On the heels of the Families First COVID Act, Congress then followed up again with bipartisan support in passing the CARES Act. And the CARES Act is important because this too was an additional amount of money And this really, I think these two pieces of legislation, they underscore the breadth of the federal response, even as the federal response to COVID was uneven at best, with some odd and sometimes troubling things that the president at the time had been saying about, COVID and the like. The CARES Act was a follow-up to this in providing assistance to large corporations through things like loan guarantees, revenue to state and local governments whose budgets had been decimated by the reduction in revenue. It provided economic support to small businesses through something called the Paycheck Protection Program, which was literally a life raft for many small businesses to keep them afloat, to be able to keep paying their workers, to not have to lay them off. A friend of mine owns a restaurant up in Vienna, Virginia, and he has a staff of 80 people. And through taking advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program that was available to him as a small business owner, he was able to keep all 80 staff members, waiters, wait staff, cooks and the like, on the payroll as we weathered this tremendous crisis. And so, there are these really profound things that occur with these pieces of legislation to keep small businesses afloat, to keep families afloat. Because, of course, part of this were also direct payments to taxpayers up to $1,200 per person, or up to $2,400 for married people if you earned an income of $75,000 or under, if you were single or filed as a single individual, or $150,000 for families that file jointly. So, some important pieces of this, components of these two federal responses very quickly. The CARES Act was signed into law by the end of March. And so a very quick response from the federal government, bipartisan support for these pieces of legislation. And as you can see, this is from a poll that was jointly produced by Morning Consult and Politico, conducted in June of 2020. You see, as you move along the screen, it'll say voters' views on who has benefited from the CARES Act. That was that second piece of legislation that I just referred to. And the question was, did the CARES Act help a lot? That's that dark green. Mint green has helped a little. The gray is don't know, no opinion. Red is did not help. And if you look at those different, different groups of people, you see by and large, the public, and this is consistent, by the way, with other polls. This is just one of many polls that I selected to take a look at this. It's consistent with the belief that the public believed that how Congress had responded to the need with the CARES Act was helpful, right? If we think about small businesses, you're looking at 2/3 indicating that it either helped a lot or helped a little, right, to provide some relief. Middle income Americans, we like to think that everybody is middle class, right? That's at least the rhetoric that we hear a lot from elected officials. But you can look at different components of this, different groups of people, certainly different economic parts of the economy or components. And we see that there was general belief that there was some assistance, some help provided by the federal government. The challenge, of course, as I said, is this is unfolding during a presidential and congressional election. And just as a benchmark, so this is a NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll of about 1,100 adults conducted between September 11th and September 16th. The previous, this poll was conducted in June of 2020. June of 2020, by the way, the U.S. had passed the 100,000 fatality rate, right? In September, we had already doubled that rate. And so if you're thinking about this in terms of kind of the story that was unfolding as it relates to COVID, but you also have very split opinions as a function of where voters were in terms of who they thought would be better suited to deal with salient issues that were in the ether, in play ahead of the elections. And recall that this was unfolding again during the time where you had COVID fatalities increasing. You also had a number of protests related to the murder of George Floyd earlier in the summer. And so that you see it here in the screen, screen, it asks, who do you think would better handle blank? And the choices were economy, crime, coronavirus, race relations. As president, you see that Donald Trump, for example, was favored. This was the only category that he was favored in, is voters believe that he would be better suited to handle the economy. Of course, when it comes to coronavirus, that had flipped. And so that narrative would be an important part of what was going on during the election season in the fall. Of course, as I said, we know that if we're thinking about the 117th Congress, so what happened after the elections with a Democratic election of a Democratic president, we have a Democratic Senate, but then a narrowed Democratic majority in the House. Suddenly the impetus and the strategies for how the parties would behave with one another really began to look more like what we see in the Congresses that we've had since about the mid-1990s, with what's called a highly polarized environment, where there's not a lot of space in between Democrats and Republicans for bipartisan compromise. In the 117th Congress, the federal government again responded to COVID, but this time with only voted support, or rather affirmative support from the Democratic Party. So Democratic Party members who in the Senate, in the House. The American Rescue Plan Act, another $1.9 trillion did not receive a single Republican vote in either the House or the Senate. The American Rescue Plan Act was similar to the CARES Act in many regards. I would like to draw your attention. And so, for example, an extension of unemployment benefits, more aid to state and local governments, again, more direct payment to individuals. There were two things that I think are notable as it relates to our universe. First is the tax incentive, specifically the child tax credit. I know that Dr. Marsh a couple of weeks ago had talked about the tremendous toll that COVID has taken on families in relation to care, in relation to women stepping back from work responsibilities outside of the home to navigate care responsibilities as schools are out, those types of things. And the child tax credit is a very important component of it, because this is designed to provide direct payments to families. $3,000 per child age 6 to 17 in a household, up to $3,600 per child 6 and under, again, targeted at families earning $150,000 or less, really designed to try to help families, a federal response designed to help families deal with some of the challenges associated with COVID. The other part, of course, is for funding for vaccine distribution and COVID testing. Mary Washington is going to be, we have in-person classes anticipated in the fall that will take place. We have an expectation of vaccines for faculty, staff, students, and the ability to make those things possible is a function of getting people vaccinated and having the resources available to not just vaccinate, but also to test and to support health care providers and healthcare facilities that make those things possible. The challenge in this environment, of course, is that other legislative priorities, either bipartisan, such as infrastructure, bridges, roads, funding for those types of things, but even party-specific things like voter issues and voter security and the like, in addition to immigration, which tend to be more party-specific, have stalled. And we see this, I know this slide is hard to see, but we see again something that Dr. Farnsworth echoed, is this idea that the public wants a federal response for lots of things, right? These are the last tables that I have are from the Pew Research Center. These are the percentage, the one on the left indicates that these are the percentage of the public, these are US adults that were polled at the start of this year, indicating that whatever the issue is, strengthening the economy, defending against terrorism, reducing healthcare costs, pick your issue, right? Should be a top priority for Congress, the president and Congress to address this year. And you see, the top two, strengthening the economy, dealing with coronavirus outbreak, are very strong priorities that are shared. when we begin to look at the wide partisan gap, so what you see on the right, we see where there can be splits. So even where you have, so if you go down to the very bottom where it says strengthening the economy, there's a lot of consensus, right, that Congress and the president should be acting to strengthen the economy. Well, how do you do that? You can do that in a number of ways, certainly that we could talk about. But even then, there's a divide between that, with Republicans by a +10 margin saying that should be a higher priority. But if you're, again, looking at that second priority of dealing with the coronavirus outbreak, which is the third line that you see on the second graph, dealing with the coronavirus outbreak is a significant priority, remains a significant priority for folks who identify as Democrats or lean Democrats, and a majority for Republicans, but not perhaps as strong as the economic component. And so what you see, again, if we're thinking about this, is that once again, considerations about COVID, its impact on the economy, its impact on schools, its impact on health are very much remain on the mind's eye of the public, but how the parties are going to respond to these things looks very different. Initial bipartisan support in the face of this calamity, and then as the political calculus rolls in, perhaps a disengagement, a disentangling between Democrats and Republicans to see where advantage can be had. If you look at what's coming up with the midterm elections, again, as a referendum on the president, we expect that Republicans, at least what history tells us, is that the out party, in this case, the Republican Party, will gain seats. And so the desire to not be viewed, as supporting certain Democratic agenda items becomes important to Republicans that are either trying to defend seats or hoping to gain seats. And one of the things, and the last thing that I will say about all this, is that it doesn't just affect Congress. We may see remnants, or we may see a continuation of these themes, rather, in the upcoming gubernatorial races that we have here in Virginia, and the statewide House of Delegate elections in Virginia, because we are one of two states that have off-year elections in those regards.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooperman and Dr. Farnsworth. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A, and some of them are more directed to one of you than the other. So we'll be letting you know who the question is directed at. And we're going to start with a question that is for Dr. Farnsworth, because it's about presidential politics. But then the hosts and I think that it also would apply to the Congress. And so we'd like to, after that, allow Dr. Cooperman to give her take on this. So this has to do with being unfairly viewed for the problems that they inherit. One of our alumni, an anonymous attendee, gave the question, would you say that presidents are unfairly viewed and judged according to what problems they inherit, especially when presidential administrations change hands? This seems especially relevant with COVID, as well as wars or good and bad economies. And maybe the flip side would be, after Dr. Farnsworth talks, does the same apply to the Congress? Do they just inherit problems and get unfairly blamed for them? So, Dr. Farnsworth.
We have a process of elections that's called retrospective voting, and that involves voters making a decision on the basis of what they have seen. So if people were happy with the president, they give them a second term. And if they weren't happy, they wouldn't get a second term. But I would argue that that's more present in the past than it is in elections today, because now everything is seen through a partisan lens. The economy looks a lot better when your party is in the White House. And so that is a significant barrier towards any kind of objective assessment of how well or how poorly a person is doing as president. But it's absolutely the case that presidents get more credit and more blame than they deserve. You could argue that the last 6 months have been really, really good for Joe Biden. If you look at the unemployment rate, if you look at the stock market, if you look at GDP gains, if you look at the daily number of people dying of COVID, the daily number of people being affected by COVID, right? You could look at this and say this has been an extraordinary 6 months compared to where we were in January, where we were in June. Now, a lot of that had something to do with Biden emphasizing getting the medications out very rapidly. That's absolutely true. Biden has behaved in a professional way to get those vaccines out. But the truth is that a lot of that improvement came from the fact that the scientific community developed this in record time. You know, in many ways, Biden benefits from the good news that comes from the research laboratories all around the country. And that wasn't something that Biden controlled. It had to do with what happened in those laboratories before he became president. But he's benefiting from it, no doubt about it. Similarly, when you're talking about the economy, you know, you have a significant point of departure. Once you become president, you inherit the good times and the bad, and you're judged for how much things get better or worse. And even though you might not have anywhere to go but up, as is sometimes the case, if you think about, say, Barack Obama in 2009 and the economy of that moment, you get turned on pretty quickly, particularly by the people of the other party, because they look at this through the lens of Democrats shouldn't be running the country, Republicans should, and so whatever Democratic does doesn't look so good to me.
I would also add that to pick up where Dr. Farnsworth left off is this idea of not just the notion of the partisan lens that you see really colors how you view candidates and the performance of the president, the issues you think are salient, that elections also, particularly at the congressional level, are increasingly nationalized. And what that means is that it's not just, Virginia 1, the congressional district where Mary Washington is. It's not just the incumbent Rob Wittman running for re-election. It's the incumbent Rob Wittman who is the party of Donald Trump and who voted, to not certify the 2020 electoral college vote in the states. That now becomes the issue, right? As opposed to, Rob Wittman, Representative Wittman, and, what he has done as a representative. And this is true not just in Virginia 1, it's true in Indiana 3 and California 46 and Florida 10, and so the idea of what used to happen with congressional races is that incumbents could, or the party that held the seat could say, look, we've been a good and careful steward of the seat. And that is still true. Re-election rates tend to be very high, but particularly among those competitive races. And so in 2020, for example, we saw two very competitive races here in the Commonwealth. Virginia 2, the second congressional district with the Democrat Elaine Luria defending her seat. And that was a seat that had flipped back and forth between Republicans and Democrats over the many years. And then in Virginia 7 with another Democrat, Abigail Spanberger, also defending her seat for a first time. It was very much a referendum on, these representatives, we're not going to pay attention to what they've done. It's just they're the party of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi, right? And of course, on the flip end, of course, any Republican is the party of Donald Trump. We're seeing that certainly now in the state elections that are taking place here in the Commonwealth as well. But this nationalization of elections makes it harder for to carve out, for individuals running for any office to really carve out a space to say, look, this is what I have done or what I would do.
Can I just ask a follow-up? What, Dr. Cooperman, was there a shift that happened at some point where these state and local elections became so nationalized?
It's been a while. I mean, from a congressional perspective, it's taken place during the 1990s, and
Okay.
I think that we see the residues of this entering in at the state level. If I don't know how much folks are watching TV, but I've already begun to see gubernatorial election campaign ads, right, for the Republican nominee Glenn Youngkin and for the Democratic nominee Terry McAuliffe, and it's sounding pretty national themes already. And certainly if you get any kind of the direct mail, those kinds of things, Youngkin is a Trump protege and McAuliffe's with the Clintons. And so, again, these things intrude into the state level. We see this in terms of the competitiveness of races, the amount of money that is now spent at state level races has increased significantly. And that also is a product of having these races become more nationalized.
Right. I want to shift back to Dr. Farnsworth. President Trump could very easily, he has taken credit for the development of a vaccine, for Operation Warp Speed, for a lot of the efforts that have gone into the vaccination, campaign. Yet it seems like the number of folks who are resisting the vaccine tend to drift to be his supporters. Is there a psychology there that you can help us understand why that's the case?
Well, I think that the key way to understand the Trump response to COVID is through the lens of the upcoming presidential election. When COVID lands in February of 2020 or early March, more of the public, it lands in March. But for the politicians, they were quite aware that the crisis was out there in February. And so they had several weeks ahead of us, really, in terms of the way we were talking about it in the country and the way that we were reacting to figure out a strategy. And the Donald Trump focus was very much trying to talk it away or talk it down. He talked about how the cases would be gone when it was summertime, how after Easter we'd go back down to zero. And so over and over again, he tried to kind of spin his way in a public relations fashion to get away from the reality of this crisis. And that didn't work. You can't jawbone away a disease. That's all there is to it. And as it becomes more and more severe and it becomes more and more obvious that we need to take drastic steps, and companies did, right? Even if the governments weren't saying shut down, a lot of companies were making the individual decisions to protect their workers, that they were not going to run the factories. They were not going to, run the stores without some greater precautions. There was going to be all these things that were going to happen because they were worried about the contamination and how that might affect their own businesses. So at that point, then the Trump strategy shifts towards then sort of minimizing it, talking about how this is really kind of a conspiracy that's coming from outside, and there's national security dimensions with, quote, a China virus, that, that somehow good patriotic Americans are not wearing masks and they're not being emasculated, I guess, for lack of a better word, because there is a macho dynamic to the Trump narrative about, wearing a mask is somehow less male or less macho, that you're making this choice. And so over and over again, Trump was saying, live your life, not unlike, the idea of like, if you don't live your life, the terrorists win after 9/11. If you don't live your life in a normal way, then the virus wins. Well, the virus always wins until there's a vaccine. And that's the big problem. And so that was the narrative. And that narrative is with us today. I mean, even after Donald Trump himself became sick with COVID, he went out of his way to prove how minimal it was. He does this driving around outside Bethesda Hospital. He makes sure that he can walk into the helicopter to get to Bethesda Naval Hospital in the first place. And so there was this whole narrative that remains with us today. What Donald Trump could say is, guess what? This vaccine was developed on my watch. Take it, stay healthy, and show up at the midterm elections. Because, one of the things that would make smart politics is to make sure that your participants are healthy enough and surviving so they can vote. It is not smart to say, let the virus take its course in the red states and with red voters. That is bad politics. But from the point of view of public relations, this isn't the calculation that the president is making. So make no mistake about it. It is exactly this red and blue divide that stands in the way of taking masks or taking precautions. You over and over again are hearing people screaming in the stores about not wanting to follow the rules. Well, these are the folks who are at greatest risk when they behave in this way. And Donald Trump could end this partisan division in a moment by saying, let's do it. Let's everybody get vaccinated. But that's not the choice he wants to make. He'd rather talk about an election that he lost, pretending that he didn't.
And I would add to that that you've got the public face of how Republicans behave and Democrats behave, and then the reality of their congressional offices. Go visit any congressional website, the official House page, the official House Senate page of any senator, any representative. And the first thing you'll see is very specific information about how your Representative X, your Senator Y, can help you get access to federal resources related to COVID relief. And so, on the one hand, yes, you very much have differences in states in terms of vaccination rates and those types of things, just as Dr. Farnsworth said, with like the most red states are the ones with the lowest vaccine rates, but you still have, representatives and senators have a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility to represent the residents of their states. Red, blue, purple, polka dot, right? And the fact that Congress has passed federal resources available to individuals for COVID relief is something that every member of Congress wants to remind their constituents of.
It's a really interesting tension between the message of COVID's going to go away, it's not a big deal, and we are going to provide relief. And we do have scientific developments that we're supporting. So much of the discussion so far has talked about how this has been a bit of a perfect storm. And I think it reminds me of a number of discussions we've had in this course about how the pandemic accelerated trends that were already underway. So Professor Cooperman, you were talking a bit about the nationalization of congressional politics starting in the 90s, really, and we've seen more of that happening now. The question that I have, I think, builds upon this, and it's a two-part question, but I think they really build upon each other pretty well. For, I think, all of us on certainly on screen right now, we've lived through a number of epidemics, endemics, pandemics, and we've never seen them politicized the way, at least most of us don't remember seeing them politicized the way that we've seen COVID politicized. So this question was asking, why is it that we lived through these other pandemics or endemics and we don't have a plan, or we didn't have a plan for COVID, whereas I seem to recall in the Bush administration, even in 2005, they were developing a plan for a pandemic, and the Obama administration. Why is it that we appeared to not have such a plan? And why is it that in this case, for this pandemic, it became so politicized to the point that we politicized the science and the scientific response? And let me turn to you first, Dr. Cooperman, to talk about how that has played out in Congress. What is it that has led this pandemic to being so politicized? Is it about the timing, or is it something about COVID?
Well, I think that that's something that I think very much depends on the perspective that you want to focus on, right? And so, if we're thinking about the partisanship component of it, and we think about, what is it that Congress does, with allocation of resources, with trying to serve constituents. In previous areas, if we think about an ongoing public health crisis, which has been HIV/AIDS, it has been more localized, right? It's been more localized to specific populations. And so the degree to which it was on the radar screen of different constituencies or different members of Congress was really a function of, kind of the where they were from and who was being impacted, those types of things, right? And so I think on the one hand, I'm thinking of like the influenza epidemic in the 1920s. Well, this was also unfolding at a time where women had just gotten the franchise, right? So I mean, I think from like if you're pulling the thread back to like other public health crises, I think what Congress looked like, what our nation looked like, was so profoundly different. What I can say is that again, and I think we see this with public opinion, there is a lot of inconsistency in what the public wants. The public wants many things at the same time, and sometimes those things are contradictory. And so you can see sustained support, for example, for a federal response. We want the federal government to do something, right? We want them to pass, for example, the CARES Act, so small businesses don't go out, that families get some support, that unemployment insurance gets extended, right? But that's also viewed through the lens of worthiness, is this notion of, I'm a taxpayer, I pay into these things, so that I want to get those benefits as a result because I'm entitled to them, I have earned them. But when it comes to other types of federal government decisions, would there be a requirement of a vaccine? If you are an employee of the federal government, would states have money withheld if they refuse to mandate vaccines? Those types of things. This is where you can get into these minefields of public opinion saying, well, I don't want the federal government, right, to tell us what to do. And so I think there is this, if you look at trying to reconcile what the public wants and how Democratic members of Congress, how Republican members of Congress tend to reconcile those, they often will pay attention to the voices that are either most familiar to them in their districts or states, or the ones that they hear the most from. And those are not necessarily reliable measures of what the public wants in any given measure. The second part of that is also knowledge. Day in and day out, most people do not pay that much attention to, nor do they care about the ins and outs of government, except for when things go wrong or things seem so out of order that they do have to pay attention, or that you've lost your job. These catastrophic events, again, like how COVID came together. And so I think, you have a couple of things. One, how are decisions made, and who is communicating to their elected officials, and what is it that they're hearing, but also that level of attention that people are paying to issues can confound and compound the messages that we hear.
One thing that I would point out in following up on this question is that it didn't have to be this way. In particular, I want to draw your attention, and for people of a certain age, they know the story of the polio vaccine. What a miracle this represented. And for those college students, ask your grandparents about what it was like before there was a polio vaccine, what the story was, because you had this horrific disease that often particularly struck young people. And the reality was that it was a miracle that was shouted with praise from all corners when an effective polio vaccine was developed. People stood in line. This was during the 1950s. And there was no partisan division. Democrats and Republicans alike said, it's nice not to have dead children. It's nice not to have dead Americans. And so let's get the vaccine. It didn't have to be this way. A leader could have said from the start, this is going to be unpleasant. This is going to take a while. This is going to work out for the best if we do it together. That's what the president said at the in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor. That's what the president said in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. That's what the president said with respect to the polio vaccine. That's what the president said during the Cold War over and over again. One president after another said, this is going to be unpleasant, but this is worth it in the end. Unfortunately, though, our last president did not go down this road of saying that this is how we can do this together. This is how we can work together. And this President Trump was an incredible departure from the very bipartisan way that Democrats and Republicans have approached threats in the past. Throughout the Cold War, throughout the crises of the 20th century, Democratic and Republican presidents often had very similar approaches to dealing with national threats, be they caused by external political actors or by healthcare crises. And it is really striking how much of a departure we saw in this last year. But that's a departure that is still with us. As you look at the public opinion data that Dr. Cooperman and I showed you all today, these divisions permeate every aspect of the conversation of COVID, even now. And people, in order to present their partisan loyalty, put themselves at health risks. It is astonishing that this kind of partisanship and signaling is more powerful than taking care of one's own health, but there we are.
That's a great segue into our last question, and I'll pose it to Dr. Cooperman, and then Dr. Farnsworth can follow up if you would like. But it's, where do we go from here? If everything is so polarized and it seems that there are no gray areas anymore, how can we heal from a pandemic and also reconcile in politics in our society?
Well, I think that's a fantastic question, and I think that a lot of folks that are consulting for candidates from both sides are thinking about how to talk in a way that people will listen, beyond the immediate reservoir of voters that they often go to. I think it goes back to, again, is this notion of Congress has a long and important history of bipartisan work to make things better. Right. And I think that the role that the federal government has played, particularly if you look at the pieces of legislation that I talked about, is that there is the opportunity for Congress, for a federal response to be a meaningful federal response. You can see this with, traditionally with, infrastructure bills is a good example. I think there's a reservoir of where, you've got bridges and roads and highways and ports and those types of things that last time I checked, both Democrats and Republicans use all of those things to go about their daily business when they go on vacation, when they go to work. So you go back to those types of things where traditionally Democrats and Republicans have been able to get along. Most recently in Congress, there was a group of 10 that came together on the Senate side, again, that very evenly divided Senate, that said, here are the points that we can work on as it relates to, for example, this infrastructure bill that is currently being touted. And this, of course, would be a win, right, for a Democratic Senate, Democratic House, and a Democratic president. And so, there is this notion, unfortunately, that when these things that we used to take for granted, these bipartisan gains are wins for everybody, right? That tide that lifts all boats, when they're perceived as helping one party over another, that's when the politics of, the equation come in. I think that, Congress at some level is also very much aware of this in terms of the low regard in which individual members of Congress or Congress, the bunch, is held, and certainly presidents and how they navigate public opinion. But I think that, in terms of like, how do we solve this? This is the stuff of what many members of Congress wish that relations were better. But the political calculus right now is one where they are in a safer place to remain safely in with their team and in their own corner.
One thing I would add to this issue is that rewarded behavior is repeated behavior. When you look at elected officials, what happens to the people who compromise? Are they rewarded? Are they more likely to move up? Are they more likely to become president? Are they more likely to be elected senators and governors? The answer is they are not. What you see increasingly in politics is that the reward is for the people who are in the most extreme position out there. Joe Biden is really kind of a departure where a more moderate choice prevailed in the nomination system. But make no mistake about it, the vast majority of the Republicans who are facing the greatest threats in 2022 are the ones who said, you know what? Maybe we should listen to the courts and the election was legitimate. They're the ones facing the greatest threat. The ones who said, wait a minute, maybe having an armed insurrection against our own place of work is problematic and we should investigate that. Those are the people who are at risk. And so the people who had even what passes for moderate politics end up roadkill in the center of the highway in American politics. I mean, if Republicans can't compromise with Joe Manchin, then what are the chances there's going to be a compromise? And certainly when you think about Democrats and Republicans on bridges, once again, you would say, wait a minute, this is something that both sides favor. The idea of a bridge staying up is not a partisan issue. But we find ourselves finding it very, very difficult to compromise. And in fairness to the elected officials, the voters aren't rewarding the people who try to make it work. They're rewarding the people who want to blow the place up. That's on the left and the right. And so that is where we are right now. It's not an optimistic point that I offer up to you. Unfortunately, studying politics is not an optimistic line of work.
What you know, as a gal who's a kind of glass half full, the last thing I will say, it perhaps put a little bit of a more positive spin on this, is that one of the things that we've seen is an increase in voter turnout. We've seen an increase in the breadth and scope of who runs for office. And I think that those things at the end of the day are what's going to save our bacon, right? You need a more engaged citizenry, not a less engaged citizenry. And that is where I am very hopeful, not just in terms of the elections that we will see this fall in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but also the midterm elections that we will see in 2022.
Well, we ran over a bit, but I think it was time well spent. I really enjoyed this quite a bit. So thank you both very much. Dr. Rosalind Cooperman and Dr. Stephen Farnsworth from our Department of Political Science and International Affairs. Great discussion. This was really terrific. Thank you. Thank you both so much. And just a quick reminder to everybody that our session on Thursday is with Dr. Claudine Farrell. That she is the department chair for our Department of History and American Studies, and she'll be talking to us about disasters of the past and how we've responded to them. So it should be a great lecture and discussion on Thursday as well. Students, we'll see you real soon for the small group discussions. Have a great evening. Thanks everybody for joining us.
So do you want us to stay here, and will you put us, no, we have